G'day everyone, I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and welcome to Unparliamentary, our fortnightly series unpacking everything that's happening in federal politics. I'm delighted to be speaking with Paul Karp today, Chief Political Correspondent for the Guardian Australia. Thanks so much for joining us today, Paul. I am very much looking forward to our chat. There's always, as always, a lot happening in federal politics. I'll just do a little bit of Zoom housekeeping for everyone. Just a reminder, you can type in questions for Paul in the Q&A box, and we'll ask those in the second half of the webinar. A reminder to please keep things civil and on topic in the chat, or we'll remove you. And lastly, a reminder that this discussion is being recorded and it will go up on our YouTube channel later this afternoon. And you can check out all our upcoming webinars at australiainstitute.org.au. And so, Paul, as always, it's been a massive couple of weeks in federal politics. The fun never stops. Huge numbers of stories around to choose from, but as always, housing is a big issue in federal politics. And this week, a lot more discussion around Labor's signature housing policy, Help to Buy. Want to just kick us off with kind of housing, but also what are some of the other big topics that we've seen in federal politics in the last week or so?
Well, the three main bills before the Senate this week are Help to Buy, which is the shared equity scheme for housing, the environment legislation, which would set up an environmental protection agency, and the Future Made in Australia, which is for production tax credits for critical minerals. And all three of those bills are things that Labor is wedged on both its left and right flanks, either because of concerns about how the bills work, or the fact that the Greens are using them for leverage to try and make other changes. So, for example, the housing bill they've used to push, negative gearing and capital gains tax reform, and a rent freeze, and a public housing developer. So those are the big battles this week on a Senate only week. Last week, there was both houses sitting, and that produced a breakthrough with the coalition agreeing to Labor's aged care reforms. And that, is increasingly they are looking to the coalition to help them pass things, because they're having, on other issues where the coalition and the Greens team up, they don't have the numbers to get things through the Senate. So unpack whichever one of those you want to dive into. There's a lot going on.
Yeah, well, we might start with the Help to Buy scheme being in front of the Senate this week. Can you just remind everyone what that's designed to do and what the politics of that are at the moment in the Senate?
Yep. So 10,000 people a year will get access to this scheme, which basically means that the government will own 30% of your house for an existing home, or 40% if the home is a new build. And what that means is that, aspiring home buyers will only need to pay 60 or 70% of the sale price of the house. So smaller deposit, smaller mortgage, cheaper to become a homeowner. Of course, the government then owns, 30 or 40% of your house, and you have to pay back that chunk when you sell. But it would be a significant advantage to people that are able to access that scheme. Now, I mean, it's come under attack from the coalition, who, think that it's unfeasible because of, limits on the value of the house. And it being a very small thing to do for supply, will only help 10,000 people a year. And as I mentioned, the Greens have used it to push for other changes that they think would be more meaningful to housing supply. And, really, this one has gone nowhere. I mean, in February, Anthony Albanese said that the Greens can vote for it or they can vote against it. Over the weekend, Max Chandler-Mather, the Greens housing spokesperson, said that really the government hadn't offered any concessions at all to get it through. So what is the point of putting it up for a vote when they haven't done anything to win the Greens votes? And it's just been days of people should pass it on its merits. And Anthony Albanese complaining that people were raising other issues in negotiations. So it's been stuck for a while now.
Mm. And so do we expect that it will just kind of hang around in the Senate? Will it be going to kind of debate, or will the government be forcing it to a vote to demonstrate that the Greens, uh, won't be
In a sense,
voting for it?
in a sense, it doesn't really matter because I mean the coalition and the Greens have the numbers to delay it and can even prevent it coming to a substantive vote if they want. But the government has legal advice that says that is a failure to pass that could help set up a double dissolution trigger. So it doesn't really matter whether it's an outright rejection of the bill or whether it's a procedural delay. It just means the government is very unlikely to get it through this week. Of course, last year they were able to get their Housing Australia Future Fund bill through after many months of negotiation, but they added billions of dollars for social and affordable housing in order to do that to win the Greens vote. And so the Greens are stroppy, what's different this time? Why aren't you coming to the party to make other beneficial changes like you did last time?
Mm.
And going nowhere at the moment.
So housing obviously is going to be a pretty potent election issue. How do you see this playing out as we head to the federal election?
Well, we know what the Greens and the coalition offering are. The coalition wants to give people access to their super to get into the housing market. The Greens want a rent freeze and reforms to negative gearing and capital gains tax, and a public housing developer to build more public housing. My question is, and I raised this in my Agenda Monday column, why is Labor leaning into this issue so much? It's obvious that people care about it, but does Labor have a substantial enough offering to go to the next election and frame it around housing? And what I was arguing in that piece was that just like they did for stage 3 tax cuts, where they came back from the summer break and they said, look, we know that we went to the election with a commitment to keep these, but it's really unfair. And, in order to give cost of living relief to everyone or nearly everyone to be better off, and we need to revamp the stage 3 tax cuts. I'm questioning, why they don't have the same approach here for negative gearing and capital gains tax. And I took as the launching off point there, that Bill Shorten's announcement of his retirement a week or two ago, where he said people weren't ready at the 2019 election, but perhaps they are ready now that there's such a housing affordability crisis. Perhaps they are ready now that the government has set their own blueprint for stage 3, which was a big political victory for them. The coalition had to wave it through because so many more people were getting more money.
Yeah, and I think that's really interesting whether or not the politics of it has changed, because it certainly feels like housing affordability as an issue. Like renters have really, the Greens have worked very hard, it feels like, to establish them as an electoral cohort essentially, and really activate the issue there. But yeah, Claire O'Neill said the government wasn't considering changes to those housing tax concessions. But as you said, if we look at stage 3, the government wasn't considering anything up until the moment that it made the changes. And kind of it feels like maybe there could be perhaps more fertile ground, certainly amongst the public. And yeah, if you look at the last couple of elections, often the people who support it are actually oftentimes high income earners in electorates like those of the teal seats. Kind of, there's a lot more recognition, I feel like, that the settings aren't working as they currently are.
And listen to their answers. There are some things that are clearly ruled out and never ever, like tax treatment of the family home when it comes to the age pension. They've been definitive on, but they have never been definitive about, never going back to negative gearing and capital gains tax. It's always, no plans, not considering things that are true until they're no longer true.
What about the coalition's kind of line and their long held policy to kind of let people raid their super to pay for a house deposit in particular. There's a lot of economists who've kind of critiqued that. And I guess it's similar to a lot of kind of first home buyers schemes in that potentially that criticism is that it just helps drive up, what people can bid for a house. Has there been much scrutiny of what the coalition is offering and the popularity of that?
Yeah, so there's been criticism, from super funds and others that this is obviously a demand side policy that will give some people more money, but that doesn't do anything for affordability. So that criticism has been made. Another point is that a lot of people don't have that much super, so it would be helping people who could probably afford to get into the housing market in a little sooner, but they're generally going to be, if they've got a large amount of super to raid, they're probably going to be like high income earners just of a slightly younger age that would benefit from it. Not really making a big difference for a lot of renters. What we really need to hear is what the coalition's supply side policies are. And there have been some hints that they're going to use financial carrots and sticks to try and get states and or local councils to approve more housing, but we really don't have the detail on that yet. And in a sense, it's very similar to Labor's policy at National Cabinet for the 1.2 million housing construction target over the next 5 years. That involves financial incentives to the states if they meet those targets, and they're just not on track to meet them because of skills shortages, needing to bring more people into the country, or big infrastructure projects are taking up all the all the labor and skills that would be required to build all that. So it's not clear enough to me yet how the coalition is going to boost supply rather than just giving people money to bid up prices.
Yeah. I want to turn next to aged care because that is somewhere where the government behind closed doors had worked out a deal with the coalition for some aged care reforms. Can you just walk us through what that deal was essentially and those changes that the government announced?
Yeah, so there's two main components. One is to give people more support to stay in their own home. So that's 4.3 billion to help another 300,000 people. And that's for things like modifications to your home so that you can live there without needing to go into residential aged care. The second component is a greater user pay element for residential aged care. But there are a few guardrails on that. First of all, it's not for the clinical care, it's for the other things, the accommodation, the food, the other services that are offered. And secondly, it's not for existing residents, it's for people that enter the system in the future. And they're essentially going to be charged more because the lifetime cap of how much you can be charged for non-clinical care expenses will be lifted to 130,000. And there'll also be the ability for the residential aged care provider to keep a small chunk of the refundable accommodation bond that you put in when you get the spot when you move into aged care. So a bit of an oxymoron there that the refundable deposit is some of it is now not going to be refunded in order to keep the sector afloat because they're under such terrible financial strain at the moment.
Mm. Just a reminder, if you're joining us today, I can see we've got a few hundred people on the line with us. You can type in questions for Paul in the Q&A box. I also note that last week was Minerals Week in Canberra, Paul, and we've seen the mining industry, I think, really come out on the front foot and attack the government on a range of things, kind of warnings about crossing the industry at your peril and really arguing that they paying a lot of tax and, they're under assault from some of the government's proposed EPBC reform changes and the prospect of things like a climate trigger. What did you make of the timing of that and how much that kind of attack landed, I guess?
Well, it's pretty unhelpful timing for the government in that they're trying to get their environmental laws, the creating an environmental protection authority through the parliament, and because they don't want to lose seats in WA, which is a resource state, their plan A is to try and get that through with the coalition. So they're not offering a climate trigger to get this through with the Greens support. They're looking for coalition support, whereas the coalition, are dragging it out. They know they've got the whip hand here. They're trying to get the government to water their bill down. So it's very unhelpful timing for Labor. I mean, a lot of these issues, though, are not even things that are currently before Parliament. A lot of this is a sort of rearguard action of big business groups, including the Minerals Council, and I know the Business Council has an event this evening as well, raising a lot of these issues. They're complaining about things that passed in, late 2022, like multi-employer bargaining, and same job, same pay. So really, I think they were caught flat-footed in the first year of the Albanese government. Labor got through a lot more industrial relations legislation than they'd foreshadowed at the election. For a lot of people, that has made a huge difference. Like if you were on a Labor hire agreement, you could have, and you're now paid the same as someone who's a direct employee, these changes can mean tens of thousands of dollars difference to you. And so I think the miners are sort of fighting a rearguard action, trying to lock the coalition into repealing as much of this as possible, and to make the case for turning the clock back on that reform that they sort of let through to the keeper.
That's really interesting because, yeah, the IR reforms seem to be, a big part of that attack. And what has the coalition's response been to those efforts? Have they promised to repeal some of those key IR reforms?
Yeah, so Peter Dutton started with the right to disconnect. He said that that was going to be part of a targeted repeal of IR legislation they didn't like. It was also included in his budget reply that they were going to repeal some elements of it. It seems pretty clear that multi-employer bargaining and same job, same pay are in the frame. We haven't got the exact delineation yet of what's in, what's out, and how far they would wind it back, but those elements seem likely set for repeal.
And I think Jane Hume mentioned some of those on Insiders on the weekend. How much do you get the sense the coalition will kind of try and run on this as an election issue as opposed to just kind of promising the mining industry it will repeal? Do you think they think it will be kind of a potent election issue for them?
Well, I understand that they would want to get this out there so that then if there is a minority government and or they were elected, that they can say that they have a mandate for it. But it seems to be opening them up to a lot of attacks from Labor. I mean, Anthony Albanese had a pretty shocking election campaign last time, but his one strong suit in that campaign was waving around that dollar coin saying, we want a 5% increase in the minimum wage. So we just want, $1 more an hour for Australia's lowest paid. And that was really his finest moment. And it just seems to me that they're letting him wave the coin around again, aren't they? I mean, I think Labor is going to have two main scare campaigns at the next election, one on nuclear power and one on wages, because the only thing worse than inflation being higher for longer than everyone would like is, inflation being higher for longer and, the prospect that you could have a wage cut. So I think Labor will be running quite heavily on that.
Yeah. And coming, I guess, to wages and the cost of living, for a couple of weeks now, it seems there's been a lot more kind of criticism of the RBA and keeping interest rates too high for too long. And we saw the former treasurer, and I think he's still the Labor president, Wayne Swan, coming out to kind of be more critical. And I guess Yeah, what do you make of that kind of, it felt like me to be a very deliberate switch from Jim Chalmers, the treasurer, and Wayne Swan kind of backing him in on that. Obviously, inflation and the cost of living is still really hurting the government. But how much is there a difference emerging between the RBA and the government, do you think?
Well, I think there's a difference between the RBA and the government and the RBA and the market, where both the government and the market are suggesting that interest rate cuts are going to have to come sooner, before the end of this year. And the RBA's advice a month or two ago was, 6 months, so not till next year. Um, I mean, I don't think that having said this publicly really um, I mean, the RBA is independent. They don't have to listen to this. Maybe they're stubborn. Maybe it makes them not want to do it. But I think it's more about just distancing the government from this this dreadful period of 6 months where we know that the next move is going to be down, but it's still, that relief hasn't started flowing yet. So they just want people to know this wasn't our fault. In our view, it could have come down sooner.
Yeah. And I've just been, I guess, really struck by how poor those the figures have been on, the fact that we're in a per capita recession, and that really it is government spending that is preventing us from heading into recession. As far as the coalition kind of sheeting home the blame to the government for cost of living woes, um, what are their points of difference? Because if it's kind of cuts to spending, that seems like a bit of a recipe for recession. What are some of the other kind of economic arguments that they're advancing at the moment?
Well, I think that is the main one. They say that they would have run bigger surpluses because they wouldn't have spent down revenue improvements like Labor did. But then, when you actually ask them which things, they seem to they seem to be counting off budget funds like the National Reconstruction Fund and the Housing Australia Future Fund. Well, we wouldn't have done those, but I mean, some of those are just money sitting in a bank account that is invested. That it's not like it's out there, pumping the economy with money and causing inflation. That they do get themselves into a lot of trouble because they say, um, well, inflation would be lower under us, so we wouldn't have had to index pensions, which, Labor is arguing means that they want to cut pensions. And it's all very unclear how they would have achieved bigger surpluses, really. That is the main point of differentiation, but is completely sort of vague.
Mm. And it appears like a probable outcome, or at least a possible one for the next election, is a kind of shared a minority government with crossbenchers, in the balance of power, Greens and maybe independents. Um, how much do you think that's factoring into what the coalition is talking about in the lead to the election and its potential as a scare campaign for the coalition?
Well, I mean, the coalition lost so many of their seats to the Teals that they have a very difficult structural barrier to achieving a majority in their own right. Um, they want people to be afraid of um, minority parliament when I don't think that anyone should be because of the long-term decline in the major party vote. It's very likely we will get one in the next term of parliament, and if not in the next term of parliament, the one after. And given the number of Teal seats, that the coalition would require crossbench support to govern. I mean, why are we terrified of the prospect of four Greens and Andrew Wilkie propping up a Labor government in minority, but we're not terrified of Bob Katter and whoever else Peter Dutton would round up to be Prime Minister if he got half a chance,
Mm.
unless he's suggesting that he'd do what Tasmanian Labor did and not even try and form government, because the idea of being in minority is so distasteful, which I think is, an electorally ridiculous strategy and shouldn't be repeated by anyone. If the major parties are on 69, 68 seats, they'll be courting the crossbench exactly like Julia Gillard and Tony Abbott did in 2010, and we should expect them to. That's how it works.
Mm. Gambling ad reforms, there's been a lot of discussions over the last couple of the weeks. The government appeared to kind of back down from what some of the original proposals there were. And there's been a lot of pressure, I think, in the wake of that for the government to really implement a total ban on gambling advertising, at least on free-to-air television. What's the latest on that campaign?
Yeah, so the inquiry report that was, chaired by Peter Murphy, but was a bipartisan, 31 recommendations, was for a total ad ban, a ban on inducements, a national regulator, a levy. So a lot of important measures. They're really only focusing on the ad ban element, and as it went to cabinet, it was not a total ad ban. It's a partial ban where ads would be banned online, in children's programming, during sport, and an hour either side, but limited to 2 an hour in other general programming. Now, of course, the problem people have with this is that children watch things other than children's programming. So, sitcoms, reality television, MasterChef, whatever, you can still have 2 gambling ads an hour during all of those. Another problem is that the really at-risk cohort is sort of 18 to 45-year-old men who, are not going to be protected by there not being gambling ads during Bluey or whatever. So they have a partial ad ban as their proposal. It hasn't gone to caucus yet, where we know a lot of MPs are upset and wanted them to go further. People like Mike Freelander and Louise Miller Frost, among others. So, but they basically don't want to annoy free-to-air media, who's become so reliant on the revenue. They say, this is a big step in the right direction. So they're hoping that people won't be upset that it's not the full thing. But, that we see new figures released last week that showed gambling losses are now up to $32 billion a year, or $1,555 for every man, woman, and child, and everyone in Australia. There's a pretty strong moral case. We need to be doing more.
Mm. We'll come to questions from the audience pretty soon, but I did wonder, we saw that back down on the gambling ads reforms. There's been a few other things where the government seems to have kind of second-guessed itself and wobbled a bit and made things worse. Things like, the census question that seem to be fumbled by the government. How do you think the Albanese government is travelling as we kind of head into this final couple of months of Parliament?
Well, I think they've correctly identified that the number one issue is cost of living, but then I think that what they've taken from that and the losing the voice referendum, that we cannot talk about anything but cost of living, is not correct. I mean, I think people want to know that you can walk and chew gum at the same time, and that the complete debacle of ruling out, then ruling in sexuality and gender questions in the census, demonstrated that by not just getting on with it in an orderly way, you can become the story. So they're trying to avoid what they consider culture war fights. They're not going to proceed with religious discrimination and protecting, queer students because they couldn't get coalition support for it. Didn't really explain why they didn't go to the Greens and crossbench to try and pass that. They did the census, but then had to back down when they realised that it was becoming more of a problem for them. They also watered down their hate speech offering. That was going to be a more general protection against vilification, but is now, really only preventing very serious incitement to violence. So they're just trying to sidestep these things that they consider culture war issues.
Mm. And I'm not sure how much you're across this, so we can move on if you like. But I was also just interested in some of the internal politics in the New South Wales Liberals after they've fumbled the nominations for local council elections, and then it seems announced a review that they hadn't actually properly asked all the people to serve on before they publicly announced it. And it seemed to be in a lot of disarray there. New South Wales, obviously, big state for the Liberal Party. How much trouble are they in there, and will they sort themselves out before the election?
So Peter Dutton and the federal executive wanted a federal intervention. So they wanted a panel of 3 people to take over running of the New South Wales division. 2 of those people are Victorian men who are 80 or approaching 80. And the third one is former New South Wales Planning Minister Rob Stokes, who they didn't ask or didn't lock in beforehand to confirm he wanted to serve. So it was very embarrassing when he said, "Oh, actually, I'm not available." Then Mark Speakman it had a counter proposal of a panel of 4 people, the 2 Victorian men and two women, Fiona Scott and Peter Seaton. And this would essentially, the Conservatives felt, watered down the whole point of the federal intervention. Eventually, that idea was voted up by the New South Wales executive and then overturned by the federal executive. So in the end, we've got a 3-person panel, 2 men, 1 woman. So not gender equal and not giving the 2 personnel that the moderates wanted to appoint. So Peter Dutton has eventually got his way, while also sort of embarrassing the Liberal Party further by, not having locked Rob Stokes in advance. But, maybe they've been saved for themselves by having a slightly more balanced, if not completely balanced, panel.
We'll come now to questions from the audience. Just a reminder, you can chuck your questions for Paul into the Q&A box there. And I've got 2 questions here that are around potential switches to the capital gains tax and the discount there. One from Vince and another from, who was the other person that I saw there? So going back to those issues of our tax reforms on the table in particular, not just for negative gearing, but the capital gains tax discount as well, because it's more or less the interaction of those 2. Do you think it's how likely do you think it is that Labor will contemplate some of those changes, or that the Greens will be making a virtue out of that ahead of the election?
Well, I mean, the thing to note here is that really the crossbench votes are already there for it. Even David Pocock and Jackie Lambie have been calling for changes on this. So it's not like it's just the Greens and that it would be too difficult to get through. I think it is the Greens and a lot of the rest of the crossbench. And if they repackaged it in a way that the revenue that was raised went back to people in the form of income tax cuts, then you could see the same dynamic as occurred in stage 3, where the coalition had to get out of the way. So Bill Shorten, when he was asked to reflect on the 2019 election, said, "Oh, in retrospect, maybe we just should have given all the money back in the form of tax cuts, and it would have been more popular." The other thing to note is that, even Liberal Senator Maria Kovacic, in her first speech to the Senate, was suggesting maybe we should limit the number of properties that people can negatively gear. So there are options that are, compromise positions that are short of abolishing negative gearing, like limiting it to, 3 houses. Like how hard a message would it be to go to the election saying, "Do you own more than 3 houses? If not, this policy doesn't affect you." If you don't own 3 houses, then, we're going to do a low and middle income tax offset, and I'll mail you $1,000 in a month's time.
Yeah.
I think that would be a very easy case to make. It's not, a death tax. It's not, trying to work out whether you have franking credits. Like, people don't own 3 houses. It's very easy to work out.
That brings me to another question from Terence, who basically had a question along those lines. So, could negative gearing be restricted to a lower number of properties? And I guess, yeah, I'm interested, are there other kind of, compromise positions that would attract, as you said, people even from the coalition? And is it Keith Wallahan as well has kind of, I think, mentioned a bit of an appetite for some of these things. Like there's more room to move than I guess where the debate is currently at. Do you think that's likely though, that we'll end up looking at some of those different options rather than just looking at total ban, total abolishment?
Well, it depends what lesson you take from the stage 3 revamp. Do you take from that the government was successful because they were prepared to revisit something that they committed not to do before the election, or do you take from that you can really only afford big changes to your election platform once before it starts to look like you're an untrustworthy person and none of it is worth anything? And so, I I would be inclined to the first view, because when you poll on these individual measures, people do want action on it. I mean, it's got to the point where even people that personally benefit from the tax concessions know how hard it is for their kids to get into the market.
Mm,
Um, I think it would be worth giving it a crack, and that's what I argued in that Agenda Monday piece, because I, I've already spoken here about what I think the two big negative themes are going to be for Labor at the next election: attacking, nuclear, and cuts to wages. But what is a second term Albanese government for? Uh,
mm.
I don't think that universal childcare is going to be enough of a platform to run on. I think they should be arguing that it's for fairness, it's for getting these things done that others talk about, but they actually have the numbers to do.
Yeah, going back to those lessons from the stage 3 tax cuts and that line that you were talking about for, like as well, because I think they did do a good job of when they made the change of explaining who it will impact and who will benefit in very clear terms. It kind of reminded me of when Joe Biden was talking about his tax cuts and who would benefit. And if you don't earn over this, like you'll be paying the same or less tax, basically. So yeah, I'm just, if they can be clear about who would benefit and who misses out and who it's not aiming for, you could avoid, I guess, those kind of scare campaigns that we saw around the dividend imputation a few elections ago. And, it's one of the signature pieces now that people associate with the Albanese Labor government is those changes to the stage 3 tax cuts. Like they did actually quite a good job of explaining them in the end. The next question is from Kate Cooper, who is asking, do you think the Labor Party is more likely to govern in minority after the next election with the support of the coalition or with the Greens?
I know that the Greens think that in, several election cycles time, that it might get to the point where Labor and the coalition are so desperate to keep them out of power that they would form like a unity a unity government against the Greens menace. But I think in the 48th Parliament, the idea that the coalition would supply Labor the votes, or vice versa, is quite small. I think that Labor will uh, try and avoid having a formal coalition or a formal agreement like Julia Gillard and Bob Brown did, but will count those Greens to give them confidence and supply. Yes, I think Greens supporting Labor is the most likely. It's just whether they can win any concessions from that, or whether Labor will say, well, what are you going to do about it? Make Peter Dutton Prime Minister? I don't think so.
A question now from Lynette Arden around climate change and being such an important issue, and what the political action on that looks like in the lead up to the next election.
Well, we are supposed to be thinking about, a 2035 target and increasing the 43% emissions reduction target. A lot of this is sort of on hold for the US election because, we could have Kamala Harris as president and everyone be looking at raising their ambition, or we could have Donald Trump as president and really the whole international architecture and the increasing ambition for emissions reduction could be completely destroyed, in which case Labor announcing a more ambitious target now um, would seem foolish. And Anthony Albanese, last time people were asking him the whole term when he was opposition leader, what's your target? What's your target? And they left it quite late because they wanted to know what the economy looked like, what the international situation looked like before they committed on that. I do think we'll see more in MyEFO for other measures like electrification and those things that can make a cost of living difference. And even the coalition, as they rant and rave about large scale renewables, say that they don't dislike rooftop solar. So we're expecting that they'll try and pretend to be green by saying rooftop solar is great. So there could be some room for action at the household level. We know that the government's also still working on sectoral plans, but beyond the electricity sector. How do we drive emissions reduction in transport and all the rest of it? There's still a lot of work to be done there because people's uptake of SUVs and four-wheel drives is actually eradicating the benefit of other people taking up electric vehicles. So that needs to be something done in other sectors of the economy as well.
Yeah. And that, I guess, brings us back to as well climate and the coalition advocating its nuclear policy. Still not a lot of details around that. Is there any update on when they're expecting to release costings for that? Is that going to be this year or just prior to the election at some point in the future?
I don't think they're going to have costings because they're going to have some expert panel that still has to advise them when they're in government of the number of reactors. Like they said, we announced 7 sites. We didn't say how many reactors there would be at each site. And we need so it just seems so far off in the never that I don't know how you could cost it. All we know is that it will be a government entity that owns them. And so, if they don't pay for themselves over 50 or 100 years or whatever assumption that they've put into that, then it will be us paying for it. And beyond that, we don't know. It's going to be off budget because they say that it will make money.
The next question I've got is from Robin Gardner, and they ask, has there been any progress on, well, they've said truth and honesty in politics. That might be a bit broad. I'm thinking here about more specifically truth in political advertising and perhaps electoral reforms. The government was intending to introduce further electoral reforms before the election. Where's that up to?
So we know Don Farrell, the Special Minister of State, is designing this. We strongly suspect that they will want to pass it with the coalition rather than with the crossbench. We know that they want spending and donation caps, but how they're structured and the value of those caps is still unknown. In a sense, some of the heat has come out of this because so much time has elapsed now that this is not going to be in place for the next election. It's going to take effect the election after next, and it keeps getting pushed back. We're now expecting to see it in the October sitting of Parliament, and I wouldn't be surprised if what we get is a very pared back, just sort of what the minor parties would call and independents would call a financial gerrymander, where the major parties set rules that make it easier for them and harder for minor parties, but that a lot of the other ideas about increasing territory representation or even about truth in political advertising fall by the wayside. And if truth in political advertising stays in there, I think it will only be for the sort of fig leaf of credibility that this is a, democratic reform package, not because there's any great enthusiasm for the idea.
Mm. I did want to ask you, I forgot to ask at the beginning about the government's proposed restrictions on young people accessing social media. So we've seen that kind of crop up in South Australia and now federally. What made me think of it was truth in political advertising and all the misinformation that you see on social media. But I think that's a really interesting one because probably if if you want to do it, there's a number of, I guess, barriers in terms of legislation being complicated and things like that. South Australia tried to, I think, more along the lines, put the onus on tech companies to figure out how to keep young people away from social media and some of the problematic content there. But it also strikes me as something that actually parents and a lot of people in the community are really worried about. So where has that issue kind of landed, and how soon before we see kind of some concrete proposals, do you think?
This one really terrifies me because the political agreement that it is a good idea has far outpaced the actual understanding or explanation of how it would work. So, the trial that of age verification that was announced in National Cabinet way back in like April is yet to begin. Like they've only just started tendering for that, and that's only going to start in October. So we've reached this point where there's a political consensus that we need this. This is a good thing, but we don't know yet how it's going to be technically feasible. Like, is it scanning people's faces? Is it requiring everyone to send in ID? Are they checking against credit cards? Isn't everyone just going to get around it with a VPN? I think there are all these technical difficulties with it. And I mean, the proposal is also vague. They didn't, in the week that they announced that they were going to do it, they couldn't even tell you what age the cutoff would
Would
be.
be.
Would be 14 or 16. So this one has a long way to go yet. I think it'll be a non-issue at the election because both sides agree with each other, and then it will just be a messy, annoying thing that the communications minister has to try and deliver in the second term of a Labor government.
Yeah, I'm really torn on this one because on the one hand, yeah, I'm really terrified of things like facial recognition for age verification. We've seen that go spectacularly wrong in other kind of policy settings and stuff. That seems like a very dangerous path to tread down. And by the same token, whenever the government talks about this, I find myself wishing they would personally ban me from social media because it's, destroys your concentration, all of those other things that we've talked about, as well as the actual harms that it is generally doing to society.
I've been thinking about it in the context of, just to link the previous two topics. I watched all the high court cases about donation caps being struck down for breaching the implied freedom of political communication, and I would be very interested to see if anyone brings or the social media age ban could survive a high court challenge, because obviously political communication is only some of what goes on social media. But this to me clearly burdens things like, Greta Thunberg, advocacy, or school strike against climate change being advertised on Facebook and all the rest of it. And the evidence of the problem that it's trying to solve just seems quite thin. I mean, mental health rates and eating disorders and all the rest of it are very serious problems. But the way that Anthony Albanese is selling this policy, being about, kids just need to get into the park and kick a football and throw a frisbee, doesn't seem to. It seems that the solution of taking this technology away for everyone under the 16, it seems completely disproportionate to the problem of people aren't having enough real world experiences.
Yeah.
I can just see it going very wrong.
Yeah, agreed. Bridget asks, is putting in place a total ban of gambling ads really that politically difficult for the Labor government?
Look, I think when you ask voters, it's very popular to have a total ban, but I think they're listening to media organizations that are afraid that they're going to lose money. So I think they'll be scaremongering about, free-to-air media is going to die if we do it. So in that sense, it would be politically difficult, but because they're listening to that constituency, not just to what voters want.
Yeah. I've got a question about, well, just really a question mark, double dissolution triggers. We've seen the Prime Minister kind of potentially float this uh, with regards to the Greens voting down some bills in the Senate. But can you tell us a little bit about the possibility there?
Okay. I think he's probably trolling them. He did this during the Housing Australia Future Fund debate as well. But while I don't think it's likely, I do think it's physically possible. The Greens seem to think it's not physically possible because what you need 3 months between the two attempts to get a bill through. And you also need it to be at least 6 months before when the House is due to expire. So basically, the Greens think there is no window because Help to Buy hasn't even been put to a vote yet. The House expires in July next year, so technically the latest date for a double dissolution is the 25th of January. How could you possibly have this 3 months, two attempts in this remaining window? I think it could happen a number of ways. Firstly, build to rent tax incentives were delayed by the Senate in June. So if they were reintroduced and put back before the Senate in the October or November sittings, that would fulfill the criterion and be a double dissolution trigger. Another way it could happen is that Malcolm Turnbull actually recalled Parliament by proroguing Parliament to have an extra sitting. And then when the ABCC and the registered organisations bills didn't go through, then used those as a trigger for a double dissolution in 2016. The same thing could happen here. If Help to Buy is rejected or delayed this week, then they could prorogue Parliament, bring it back in mid-December, and then call an election, in mid to late January. So it's possible. It's not probable. It's good that everyone has raced for their constitution and their sitting wake calendar and tried to work it out. It's a bit of fun. Maybe it'll be a one-day story and it'll never happen. Although I will say that I think that electorally the maths is pretty reasonable for Labor if they did this, because they currently have 25 senators in a Senate of 88. If they can keep a third of voters, if they can get a primary vote in the low 30s, they could get 4 out of every 12 senators in each of the 6 states, 24 senators, plus 1 in the ACT and the NT, 26. They could go forward from 25 to 26 senators at a double dissolution. And a double dissolution would be a wrecking ball to the coalition, who would lose seats to right-wing parties like One Nation, and it would also pose difficulties for the Greens, who might lose seats to legalise cannabis. It would also yank seats off everyone who was elected under a major party banner and then decamped to the crossbench. So ex-Labor Senator Fatima Payman, ex-Green Senator Lydia Thorpe, and ex-Liberal Senator David Van would all be tipped out and would have to sing for their supper and get elected off their own steam. So, it's not likely, but I disagree with the idea that Labor would get smashed at this election, or it's not physically possible. So never count it out.
Yeah, that's the politics of it for Labor is obviously something they would strongly consider it, and they obviously wouldn't do it unless they thought they'd come out better off. The next question that I've got is from Paul Dominic, who asks, could you explain the government's opposition to incorporating a climate trigger in the environmental approvals regime? That was what we were talking about earlier, some of the EPBC reforms.
Well, it seems to be that climate is solved by the safeguard mechanism and not considering climate at the environmental approval stage. Because actually, the way carbon accounting works is that um, a country is liable for the emissions that are generated in your country, in your economy. So they don't want to not for emissions that are generated, say, when you export LNG and that's burned overseas. So what Labor does not want is climate being used to thwart gas projects, because there will be emissions when that gas is burned overseas. They don't want that. They're pro-gas. They want to support those developments, and they don't want to throw up roadblocks to them. Now, from the perspective of the planet, rather than the carbon accounting rules, it all goes into the atmosphere. It's all bad for the environment. So the Greens would say we should not be taking out of the ground to begin with. So I see both sides of this argument, but from Labor's point of view, climate is dealt with by other legislation, and they don't want it to be a roadblock to projects.
We might wrap it up there. So thank you very much, everyone, for your wonderful questions. As always, I'm sorry I can't get to everything, but I want to thank Paul for his time today, and thank you all for coming along. We have had a few hundred people on the line with us this week, and it's getting bigger and bigger as we get to the federal election. So thanks for your interest in coming along today. Don't forget, you can catch up with the recording from this on YouTube, and you can find our upcoming webinars on our website at australiainstitute.org.au. We'll be chatting to Guardian UK columnist George Monbiot on Thursday evening. So don't forget to tune in for that one. Again, it's free and you can register on our website. Thanks again for your time today, Paul, and we'll see you again soon. Hopefully, have fun in Parliament.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye. Thanks for watching. If you'd like to keep up to date with all our latest research and work, sign up to our newsletter. Delivered every fortnight, it includes behind-the-scenes updates from Richard Dennis, an exclusive cartoon from Judy Horacek, details for our upcoming events and webinars, as well as explainers, graphs, and not to mention the latest cutting-edge research and analysis from the team here on the key issues that are facing Australia. Click the button on your screen to check it out.